In the heart of Siberia and the Kazakh steppes lie places that the authorities prefer to keep quiet about. Abandoned spaceports and testing grounds where doomsday weapons were tested. Rusty rockets, radioactive craters, ghosts of the Soviet era. What really happened at these secret facilities? What experiments were conducted behind barbed wire? And why is access to these sites still strictly limited today? Now, we will reveal the secrets that have been hidden for decades. Get ready to learn the truth about places where science bordered on madness. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new investigations into the secrets that the authorities are hiding from us. And in the comments, let's discuss. Do you think that Soviet experiments with psychotronic weapons and weather control were really carried out? Or are these just conspiracy theories? Share your opinion. The Cold War turned the Soviet Union into a giant laboratory of death. While the world watched the USSR's space achievements, a completely different story was unfolding in the depths of the country. Thousands of square kilometers of Siberian taiga, Kazakh steppes, and Arctic tundra were turned into secret testing grounds where technologies capable of destroying humanity were tested. These places were not created simply for scientific experiments. They were part of a grand plan to confront the West. A plan in which human lives and nature meant less than military superiority. Soviet testing grounds were built on the principle of absolute secrecy. They were not marked on maps. Newspapers did not write about them, and even the relatives of military personnel were forbidden to know where their loved ones were serving. People disappeared in these places, and their fates were lost in archives marked top secret. But why was such secrecy necessary? The answer is simple. The test sites did not just test weapons. They created tools for the potential end of the world. Every rocket launch, every nuclear explosion brought the world closer to a catastrophe that people preferred not to think about. Today, many of these facilities are abandoned. Rusty launch pads, dilapidated hangars with spaceships, radioactive craters. All of this is a reminder of the grandeur and madness of the Soviet era. But abandonment does not mean safety. These places continue to hold secrets, and some of them remain active, although they are officially considered closed. What really happened at these test sites? What experiments were conducted in complete secrecy? And why, even today, decades after the collapse of the USSR, is access to these territories strictly limited? The history of Soviet test sites began in 1946, when Stalin gave the order to create a missile test site in the Astrakhan region. The choice fell on the village of Kapustin Yar, a remote place in the lower reaches of the Volga, where tests could be carried out away from prying eyes. But that was only the first step. Soon, secret facilities began to appear throughout the USSR. From Plesetsk in the north to Semipalatinsk in the south, from Baikonur in the steppes of Kazakhstan to Novaya Zemlya in the Arctic. Each of these test sites had its own specialization, but they were all united by one goal: to make the USSR unbeatable in the arms race. Interestingly, many of the test sites were created in places where people had previously lived. Entire villages and settlements were wiped off the face of the earth, and their inhabitants were resettled without explanation. The official version was always the same: strategic necessity. But what was hidden behind these words? Why were these particular places chosen? There is a theory that some test sites were built in areas with abnormal geophysical activity. Allegedly, Soviet scientists knew about the existence of energy faults that could enhance the effect of experiments or even open up access to unknown forms of energy. It sounds like science fiction, but documents declassified in the 1990s contain references to geomagnetic research and experiments with space-time anomalies. The test sites became a place where science bordered on mysticism. Tests were conducted not only during the day, but also at night, when, according to some scientists, the Earth's energy fields are in a special state. Eyewitness accounts are full of references to strange light phenomena, unexplained equipment failures, and cases of mass hallucinations among personnel. Official reports attributed this to stress and radiation exposure, but there were those who believed that the test sites awakened something ancient and dangerous. It is no coincidence that many of these places, after their closure, became overgrown with legends of ghosts, curses, and unexplained disappearances. But the most frightening thing about the history of Soviet test sites is the human cost. Thousands of military personnel, scientists, and workers were exposed to lethal radiation without knowing the danger. Nuclear tests were conducted with minimal safety measures, and people were sent to the epicenter of the explosion just a few hours after detonation. Many of them died of radiation sickness, never knowing that they had been victims of an experiment. Their names are not immortalized in memorials. Their feat is not recognized by the state. They remain nameless victims of the Cold War, buried under the seal of secrecy. But isn't it a conspiracy to hide the truth about the thousands who died in order to preserve the image of a great power? Kapustin Yar became the cradle of the Soviet missile program, but also the place where the boundaries between science and madness were first crossed. The test site was created on May 13, 1946, by personal order of Stalin. The location was chosen by Major General Vasily Voznyuk, a man with an iron grip who personally selected people to work at the secret facility. The choice fell on the village of Kapustin Yar in the Astrakhan region, a deserted area where tests could be carried out without fear of unnecessary witnesses. But from the very beginning, this place was shrouded in mystery. Local residents told of strange phenomena that had been observed in the steppe long before the military arrived. According to legends, as far back as the 19th century, these lands were considered cursed. Cossacks avoided them, and old people warned young people not to go there after sunset. They said that lights wandered in the steppe, luring travelers who then disappeared without a trace. There were stories of time slips, when a person would enter a certain area and come out hours later, even though it seemed to them that only a few minutes had passed. The Soviet authorities dismissed these stories as superstition, but there is documentary evidence that geophysical studies were conducted before the construction of the test site began, the results of which were immediately classified. What did the scientists discover? And why was this particular place chosen for the USSR's first missile test site? Construction proceeded at an incredible pace. Thousands of Gulag prisoners and military builders worked around the clock, erecting launch complexes, bunkers, warehouses, and residential settlements. The conditions were brutal. Summer heat of over 40 degrees Celsius was followed by winter frosts. Medical care was minimal, and no one cared about safety. Many died during construction and were buried in unmarked graves on the test site itself. According to some sources, hundreds of bodies lie beneath the foundations of the launch pads. It is no coincidence that rumors have always circulated among the test site staff about the ghosts of builders who appear at night near the old facilities. On February 20th, 1956, an event took place at Kapustin Yar that forever changed the nature of the test site. The first test of a nuclear missile was conducted here. The R-5 missile delivered a nuclear warhead to the Astrakhan steppe, where the explosion occurred. It was the beginning of a new era, an era when humanity gained access to weapons of self-destruction. But few people know that after this explosion, inexplicable things began to happen at the test site. Instruments recorded strange energy surges unrelated to radiation. There were cases when equipment failed for no apparent reason, and people near the epicenter had visions. One of the participants in that test, a reserve colonel who agreed to give an interview only anonymously in the late 1990s, said that after the explosion, they went to measure the radiation level in the crater. And there, in the very center, they saw something. It looked like a tear in space, as if the fabric of reality had been damaged. Inside this rupture, strange images were visible, incomprehensible structures that defied description. The phenomenon lasted several minutes, then disappeared. All the instruments malfunctioned at that moment, and the film in the cameras was exposed, even though there was no bright light. The officers were forced to sign non-disclosure agreements, and the incident was removed from official reports. From 1957 to 1959, tests of the Buran intercontinental ballistic missile were conducted at Kapustin Yar. It was one of the most ambitious programs of the USSR to create a missile capable of delivering a nuclear warhead to the United States. The program ended in failure, but the reasons for its closure still raise questions. Officially, technical problems were cited, but there is a theory that an incident occurred during one of the launches that forced the country's leadership to shut down the program. According to rumors, the missile veered off course and fell in an unknown area of Kazakhstan, where it exploded, creating an anomalous zone. Rescue teams sent to search for debris allegedly encountered something they could not explain. All participants in the expedition were isolated, and the rocket crash site is still closed to visitors. On March 16, 1962, Kapustin Yar was transformed from a missile range into a cosmodrome. The Cosmos 1 satellite was launched from there. From that moment on, the range was used to launch small research satellites. But military tests continued. Moreover, it was in the 1960s that experiments began at Kapustin Yar that went beyond the scope of normal military activities. It is said that psychotronic weapons were tested here, devices capable of affecting people's minds from a distance. There is no documentary evidence of this, but there are too many coincidences and strange facts to ignore this theory. Why, for example, was there an unusually high percentage of mental disorders among the test site personnel? Why did many military personnel complain of memory lapses and recurring nightmares after serving at Kapustin Yar? On the opposite end of the country, in the Arkhangelsk taiga, an even more secret facility was being built, the Plesetsk Cosmodrome. While Kapustin Yar was at least marked on maps as a populated area, Plesetsk was completely erased from reality. This place did not officially exist. The military personnel who worked there were not allowed to tell their families where they were. In their letters, they wrote the address Moscow 400 or Leningrad 200, fictitious post office boxes that concealed the facility's actual location. Plesetsk was a ghost that cast no shadow on the map but played a key role in the military strategy of the USSR. But why was this particular place chosen for the creation of a cosmodrome? And what secrets do its abandoned launch complexes hold? The formation of missile units in the Plesetsk area began on July 15, 1957. The location was not chosen by chance. First, its northern location allowed rockets to be launched into polar orbits, which was critical for military intelligence. Second, the dense forests and remoteness from large cities ensured maximum secrecy. But there is a third reason, which is not usually spoken about openly. The archives of the Russian Geographical Society contain documents from pre-revolutionary expeditions that explored these lands at the end of the 19th century. Researchers noted strange magnetic anomalies and unusual compass behavior in certain areas. Local residents, the indigenous Nenets people, considered some parts of the forest sacred and off-limits, calling them places where time flows differently. The construction of the Cosmodrome was carried out in absolute secrecy. By December 1965, test and launch complexes for space rockets had been built. On March 17, 1966, the Vostok 2 Baikonur two-carrier rocket with the Cosmos 1-12 military satellite was launched from Launch Pad Number 1. It was the first space launch from Plesetsk, but far from the last. Throughout its history, the Cosmodrome has launched about 2,500 satellites for various purposes and conducted about 600 ballistic missile tests. For a long time, Plesetsk was the world leader in terms of the number of launches, leaving even Cape Canaveral in the United States behind. But what lies behind these impressive figures? Why was the spaceport, which was supposed to glorify Soviet cosmonautics, kept in absolute secrecy? The answer lies in the true purpose of Plesetsk. It was not so much a spaceport as a launch pad for intercontinental ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads. Satellites were just a cover for the main activity. Plesetsk was one of the key elements of the Soviet nuclear deterrence system, a place from which, in the event of war, missiles with warheads capable of turning enemy cities into radioactive ash were to be launched. This explains why, even after the collapse of the USSR, access to most of the spaceport's facilities remains closed. On March 18, 1980, the worst tragedy in the history of Soviet cosmonautics occurred at Plesetsk. While preparing for launch, a rocket exploded on the launch pad. 48 people were killed, and dozens suffered severe burns. The disaster was classified, and information about it did not reach the press. The relatives of the victims were told that their loved ones had died in the line of duty without revealing any details. Only years later did the truth begin to seep out. But the official version of the causes of the explosion raises serious doubts. The commission blamed the combat crew, stating that the explosion was caused by improper actions taken to repair a leak in the oxygen line. This is a classic tactic, to blame the dead, who cannot defend themselves. However, witnesses claim that the picture of events was quite different. Many saw that the initial flash did not occur where the alleged leak was, but in a completely different part of the rocket. Moreover, a year later, another similar incident occurred, which was prevented, and then the true causes became clear: a defect in the rocket's design, not human error. But admitting this would have meant undermining the reputation of the Soviet rocket industry. Therefore, the truth was swept under the rug, and the memory of the victims was immortalized only by a modest memorial in the closed city of Mirny. Isn't it a conspiracy to hide the true causes of the tragedy, so as not to spoil the image of a great power? Plesetsk is surrounded by legends and rumors. Local residents talk about strange phenomena in the sky. Not ordinary rocket launches, but something else. Luminous objects that move at incredible speeds and change direction at right angles. Strange sounds coming from the forest at night, similar to a low-frequency hum, which causes headaches and a feeling of anxiety. There are stories of people who got lost in the forests around the Cosmodrome and came out of there with memory lapses, not remembering what happened to them. Skeptics explain this by the effect of infrasound from rocket engines or the psychological influence of the secrecy of the facility. But aren't there too many coincidences for simple explanations? Were experiments conducted at Plesetsk that we still know nothing about? The city of Mirny was created specifically to serve the Plesetsk Cosmodrome. It was a closed city, surrounded by barbed wire and checkpoints. You could only get in with special permission, and you could only live there if you had access to classified work. For the rest of the world, Mirny did not exist. It was not on maps and was not mentioned in reference books. The people who lived here led a strange double life. Inside the city, they were ordinary families with children, schools, and shops. But outside the fence began a territory of absolute secrecy, where every word could be treason against the motherland. This duality left its mark on the psyche of the residents. How do you live knowing that your life is a state secret? Mirny was built according to typical Soviet designs for closed cities. Prefabricated high-rise buildings, narrow streets, obligatory monuments to Lenin, and a palace of culture. But there was one feature that distinguished it from other closed cities. There was a special atmosphere here that is difficult to describe in words. Residents spoke of a constant feeling of being watched, not only by the KGB, but by something else. There was a feeling that the very air here was saturated with secrecy. At night, people often woke up to a strange hum, the source of which was impossible to determine. It seemed that the sound was coming from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Doctors attributed it to vibrations from rocket engines at the Cosmodrome. But why then did the hum not stop even on days when there were no launches? Children who grew up in Mirny learned the rules of secrecy from an early age. They were told not to tell outsiders where they lived, what their parents did, or what they saw and heard. This shaped a special type of personality, people who were accustomed to keeping secrets, even if those secrets concerned the most mundane things. Interestingly, among Mirny school graduates, there is an unusually high percentage of those who later worked in the special services or at secret facilities. Coincidence? Or was the system of closed cities a way of selecting and educating a special type of citizen? People for whom state secrets were more important than anything else? Life in Mirny was surrounded by prohibitions. It was forbidden to photograph certain buildings, to walk in certain areas, to ask unnecessary questions. But the strangest thing was the prohibitions that had no obvious explanation. For example, residents were advised not to visit certain areas of the forest outside the city. Officially, this was explained by security concerns, but no one gave any specifics. Those who violated this prohibition reported strange sensations: disorientation in space, dizziness, and a feeling of fear for no apparent reason. Some claimed to have seen strange structures in the forest, concrete structures of unknown purpose, surrounded by barbed wire and hung with signs warning of radiation danger. What were they? spent nuclear fuel storage facilities, or something else that they preferred to keep secret, even from the residents of the closed city. In the 1990s, after the collapse of the USSR, life in Mirny changed. The city was partially declassified, and passes began to be issued to outsiders. But the atmosphere of secrecy remained. The Cosmodrome continued to operate, and launches continued. Moreover, there were signs that a new phase of activity had begun at Plesetsk. Residents began to notice an increase in the number of launches at night, when visual observation is difficult. There were frequent cases when, after launches, unusual trajectories of satellites were observed in the sky, as well as strange objects that maneuvered and changed altitude as if they were under control. Official comments were evasive: orbit correction, testing of new engines. But does that explain everything? Today, Mirny is a city of paradoxes. On the one hand, it is an ordinary Russian city with housing and utility problems, unemployment, and population outflow. On the other hand, it is a gateway to a world that remains closed to most people. The Plesetsk Cosmodrome is still operating, still launching satellites and rockets, still keeping secrets. And the residents of Mirny continue to live in the shadow of these secrets, knowing that their city is not just a dot on the map, but part of a system that extends far beyond the understanding of the average person. Perhaps this is why many who have left Mirny speak of a strange feeling of nostalgia. They miss not the place, but the feeling of being part of something bigger, of a mystery that made their lives special. Baikonur is a name known throughout the world. It was the flagship of the Soviet space program, the place from which humanity took its first step into space. On April 12, 1961, Yuri Gagarin took off from here. Baikonur became a symbol of the triumph of Soviet science and technology, proof that socialism could outpace capitalism in space exploration. But behind the glamour of victory lay another reality, a reality of secrecy, sacrifice, and projects that were kept quiet. Baikonur was not only a spaceport, but also a testing ground for intercontinental ballistic missiles, a place where the instruments of nuclear war were prepared. And today, when many of the spaceport's facilities are abandoned, they bear witness to both the greatness and the madness of the Soviet era. The spaceport was founded on June 2, 1955, in the Kazakh steppe, 300 kilometers from the actual city of Baikonur. It was deliberate misinformation to name the spaceport after a city located far from it. In this way, the Soviet leadership tried to confuse Western intelligence. The actual location of the Cosmodrome was a state secret. Construction was carried out by prisoners, military builders, and civilian workers. Conditions were incredibly harsh. In summer, temperatures rose above 40 degrees Celsius, and in winter, they dropped below 30 degrees Celsius. Drinking water was brought in from far away, and medical care was minimal. The exact number of people who died during construction has not yet been declassified. A huge number of historic launches were carried out from Baikonur: the first artificial Earth satellite, the first man in space, the first female cosmonaut Valentina Tereshkova, and the first human spacewalk all started here. But there were also failures that people did not like to talk about. Disasters that cost the lives of dozens of people. Rocket explosions at launch, booster blocks falling on residential areas, accidents during refueling. On October 24, 1960, one of the most terrible disasters in the history of cosmonautics occurred at Baikonur: the explosion of the R-16 rocket on the launch pad. 126 people were killed, including the commander-in-chief of the missile forces, Marshal Mitrofan Nedelin. The disaster was kept secret for many years, but even this tragedy did not stop the space race. Launches continued, and each one was a risk. The Cosmodrome lived in a state of constant tension. The staff worked themselves to exhaustion, the equipment was operated at the limit of its capabilities, and safety was often neglected in the name of meeting planned targets. This atmosphere of constant stress left its mark on people. Many cosmonauts and engineers admitted that after working at Baikonur, they were left with a strange feeling, as if they had touched something beyond human understanding. Space was both attractive and frightening, and the Cosmodrome itself was a place where the line between the possible and the impossible was blurred. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Baikonur found itself on the territory of independent Kazakhstan. Russia leases the Cosmodrome for $115 million a year. Launches continue, but many facilities have been abandoned. Old launch complexes, hangars, technical buildings, all of this is slowly being destroyed by the steppe winds and the passage of time. And it is in these abandoned areas that the most interesting evidence of the past is preserved. Enthusiasts and researchers who manage to penetrate the closed territories find amazing things there. Secret documents left behind in the rush of evacuation, samples of technology that has never been declassified, traces of experiments that are not mentioned in open sources. The underground structures of Baikonur are of particular interest. It is known that there is an extensive network of bunkers, tunnels, and storage facilities under the Cosmodrome. Officially, they were intended to protect personnel in the event of an accident or nuclear strike. But the size of these underground complexes suggests that they may have had another purpose. There is evidence that some tunnels lead nowhere. They simply end in blank walls, as if construction was suddenly stopped or bricked up. Why were these structures needed? What was stored or tested there? Access to the underground is strictly limited, and maps of underground communications are classified. But rumors that something important is hidden under Baikonur continue to circulate. Perhaps samples of secret Cold War developments are still stored there? Or were experiments conducted there that they preferred to keep away from prying eyes, even at a classified spaceport? The abandoned hangars of Baikonur store real relics of the Soviet space program, the reusable Buran spacecraft. They were the pride of the USSR, a response to the American shuttles. Proof that the Soviet Union could create technologies that were not inferior to those of the West. The Buran Energia program was launched in 1974 and consumed enormous resources. The country's best minds worked on creating a spacecraft capable of launching cargo into orbit, conducting experiments, and returning to Earth. On November 15, 1988, the only fully functional Buran made its first and last flight. It was a triumph of Soviet engineering. The spacecraft took off, orbited the Earth twice, and landed autonomously in automatic mode, something that American shuttles could not do. But a few years later, the program was shut down, and the Burans themselves were abandoned in hangars, slowly decaying and turning into ghosts of their former glory. Why was the Buran program shut down? The official version is a lack of funding after the collapse of the USSR. But there are other opinions. Some experts argue that the real reason was different. The program was originally created not only for peaceful space exploration, but also for military purposes. Buran was supposed to become an orbital bomber capable of launching nuclear weapons into orbit. and dropping them on any point on the planet. This would have been an absolute guarantee of the USSR's nuclear superiority. But after the end of the Cold War and the signing of arms reduction treaties, the program lost its meaning. It was shut down not because of money, but because of changes in the geopolitical situation. However, the technical documentation and developments remained. And who knows if they are now being used in new secret projects. The fate of the Buran spacecraft that were built is tragic. The only spacecraft that flew into space, Product 101, was destroyed on May 12, 2002, when the roof of the assembly and test building at Baikonur collapsed. 8 workers who were repairing the roof died under the rubble. The collapse occurred because the building had not been maintained for years. But questions arise. Why was such an important structure, housing a unique spacecraft, abandoned to the mercy of fate? Why was no preventive maintenance carried out? Perhaps the destruction of Buran was not an accident, but a way to get rid of evidence of a program that they wanted to forget. After the disaster, the remains of the spacecraft were cut into pieces and, according to some reports, sold to China. Symbolically, the Soviet space dream ended up in a Chinese landfill, but 2 other Buranas still exist. They are located in an abandoned assembly and refueling building at Site 1-12A of the Baikonur Cosmodrome. These are Product 102, also known as Berry or Bird, and Product 201, Baikal. The first was 70 to 95% complete and was planned for use in the second spaceflight. The second is a test model, which was 30 to 50% complete. These ships stand in a huge hangar, slowly decaying. Rain and snow penetrate through the debris, broken glass, and leaky roof. The thermal insulation is peeling off, the metal structures are rusting, and the once advanced electronics are turning into junk. In 2015, French photographer Ralph Mireis secretly entered the territory and took a series of photographs of these abandoned ships. The photos shocked the world. They show how the greatest achievement of space technology has turned into a pile of rusty metal covered with bird droppings and dust. What is striking about the story of the Buran is not only the technical perfection of the project, but also the speed with which everything was forgotten. It would seem to be a national treasure, a symbol of space power. But after the program was shut down, the ships were abandoned like useless junk. No one bothered to preserve them, create a museum, or turn them into a tourist attraction. They were simply left to rot in a hangar on the edge of the Kazakh steppe. Why? One theory is that the authorities wanted to erase the memory of the project because it was linked to military developments that violated international treaties. Buran was not just a spacecraft, it was a weapon, and it was impossible to admit this publicly. There is also a more mystical version. Strange rumors circulated among the staff working with Buran. They said that the ships were cursed. Too many people died during their creation and testing. Too many accidents happened for no apparent reason. One of the program's leading engineers committed suicide on the eve of the first flight, leaving a note in which he wrote about an evil force embedded in the metal. This was attributed to mental illness, but after his death, new strange events began to occur. Technicians who serviced the ship before launch complained of headaches, nausea, and a feeling of causeless fear when inside the Buran. Instruments recorded unexplained energy surges. They tried not to publicize any of this, but rumors spread. And after the only Buran that ever flew was destroyed when the roof collapsed, many saw this as confirmation of the curse. Coincidence? or retribution for man's attempt to create something beyond the limits of what is permissible. Today, enthusiasts and researchers of space history dream of saving the remaining Burans. There are projects to restore them and turn them into museum exhibits. But nothing changes. The ships continue to decay in an abandoned hangar. The Russian government shows no interest in preserving them, and Kazakhstan does not consider them part of its heritage. It turns out that no one needs the greatest achievement of Soviet cosmonautics. This is a symbol of how quickly glory turns into oblivion. And it makes you wonder, how many more secrets are kept in the abandoned hangars of Baikonur? How many other projects, just as grandiose and dangerous, were started and abandoned, erased from history and memory? Perhaps the Buran spacecraft are just the tip of the iceberg, the visible part of a huge system of secret developments, most of which are still hidden from us? If Baikonur was a showcase of Soviet space power, then Novaya Zemlya was its dark underbelly. This archipelago in the Arctic Ocean became a testing ground for the most terrifying experiments in human history. Here, nuclear weapons of such destructive power that they could destroy entire continents were tested. Novaya Zemlya became a place where man played God without thinking about the consequences. On September 17, 1954, a state-run central nuclear test site was established on the southern island of the archipelago. The indigenous population, the Nenets, who had lived there for centuries, were forcibly resettled. They were told that this was a temporary measure, but they never returned home. Their lands became a restricted zone, where no human foot would tread for many generations to come. From 1955 to 1990, 224 nuclear tests were conducted on Novaya Zemlya, 94% of all nuclear explosions in the history of the USSR. Of these, 87 were aerial, 1 was ground-based, 3 were surface-based, 132 were underground, and 1 was underwater. The power of some of the charges was measured in tens of megatons, thousands of times more than the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Each such explosion was an experiment on nature, a test of how far humans could go in their desire for destruction. And each explosion left traces: radioactive contamination of soil, water, and air, mutations in living organisms, changes in the Earth's magnetic field. But the most frightening thing was the impact on people. The military personnel who participated in the tests received lethal doses of radiation, often without even knowing it. They were sent to the explosion zone a few hours after detonation, when the radiation level was still deadly. Their task was to study the consequences of the explosion, collect soil samples, and assess the damage. People worked without proper protection, in ordinary military uniforms, wearing respirators at most. Many died within a few years from radiation sickness. Their deaths were not linked to the tests. Other causes were written in the documents: pneumonia, heart failure, accidents. Families received no compensation and did not know the truth. It was a conspiracy of silence in which the state hid the price of its ambitions. The test site on Novaya Zemlya is surrounded by legends and rumors. Local residents from the mainland talk about strange phenomena observed in the sky above the archipelago. Pillars of light reaching into space. Northern lights of unusual colors, purple, red, green, that appear even in summer, when normal auroras are impossible. Fishermen who accidentally came too close to the restricted area tell of memory lapses and disorientation. One of them claimed to have seen an island that does not appear on maps. a land covered with strange vegetation and surrounded by light. When he tried to get closer, his boat's engine stalled, and his compass began to spin wildly. He managed to get away, but when he returned with other people, the island was gone. Hallucination? Or did the test site awaken something that exists on the edge of reality? There is a theory that not only nuclear tests were conducted on Novaya Zemlya. There is talk of secret experiments with geophysical weapons, devices capable of causing earthquakes, tsunamis, and changing the weather. Allegedly, Soviet scientists were working on technologies that could control tectonic processes using the energy of nuclear explosions to affect the Earth's crust. There is no documentary evidence, but there is circumstantial evidence. In the 1960s, unusual seismic activity unrelated to known tests was recorded in the Novaya Zemlya area. American seismic stations recorded underground tremors of a strange nature. They did not correspond to the characteristics of either earthquakes or nuclear explosions. What was it? Tests of a new type of weapon? Or unsuccessful experiments that caused something unexpected? In 2022, reports emerged that Russia was resuming activity at the test site. Satellite images showed the construction of new facilities, equipment activity, and the arrival of military personnel. There were no official comments, but experts expressed concern. Could it be that the test site, which was supposed to be closed forever, was preparing for new tests? International treaties prohibit nuclear testing, but who can control what happens on a remote Arctic archipelago, where access is restricted to outsiders? Novaya Zemlya remains a place where rules do not apply, where the state can do whatever it wants, far from prying eyes. And that is frightening, because the history of the test site has shown that when the authorities are given the opportunity to act in secret, the consequences can be catastrophic. On October 30th, 1961, an explosion rocked Novaya Zemlya, forever changing humanity's understanding of its own destructive power. It was the Tsar Bomba, a thermonuclear device with a yield of 58 megatons, the most powerful explosive device ever tested by humans. The explosion was so powerful that the shock waves circled the globe 3 times. The flash of light was visible for 1,000 kilometers, and the mushroom cloud rose to a height of 67 kilometers, breaking through the troposphere and reaching the mesosphere. Seismic waves were recorded around the world. It was a miniature apocalypse, a demonstration that man had created a weapon capable of destroying the planet itself. But why was such a monstrous test necessary? And what were its consequences? The official version was that it was a demonstration of the power of the USSR, a warning to the West that the Soviet Union possessed weapons of unprecedented destructive power. Nikita Khrushchev openly declared that the USSR was capable of creating a 100-megaton bomb, and the Tsar Bomba was proof of these words. But there is another version. Some researchers believe that the true goal was not to intimidate the enemy, but to test the hypothesis about the possibility of causing a global catastrophe. There were theories that a sufficiently powerful nuclear explosion could cause a chain reaction in the atmosphere that would destroy all life on Earth. Scientists debated whether this was possible, and the Tsar Bomba test was an experiment designed to verify these calculations. Fortunately, no chain reaction occurred, but the very fact that such an experiment was conducted is terrifying. Humanity literally played Russian roulette with its own existence. The bomb was dropped by a Tu-95 strategic bomber piloted by Major Andrei Durnovtsev. The plane took off from the Olenia airfield on the Kola Peninsula. The bomb was dropped at an altitude of 10,500 meters and detonated at an altitude of 4,000 meters. This was done to increase the radius of destruction and protect the carrier aircraft. But even at such an altitude, the crew was in serious danger. The shockwave caught up with the bomber, even though it had flown almost 50 kilometers away and managed to gain additional altitude. The aircraft lost more than a kilometer of altitude and nearly went into a tailspin. The pilots miraculously managed to control the aircraft and return to base. However, many of them subsequently suffered from the effects of radiation exposure and psychological trauma. Durnovtsev lived to be 82 years old, but until the end of his life he had nightmares about that flight. The consequences of the explosion were catastrophic for the nature of Novaya Zemlya. All organic matter within a radius of 55 kilometers was completely destroyed. Trees at a distance of 100 kilometers were knocked down and charred. Rocks melted, forming glass surfaces. A crater formed in the epicenter zone, not from the impact, but from the fact that the soil literally evaporated under the influence of temperatures reaching millions of degrees. Radioactive contamination spread over vast areas. But the strangest thing was the long-term consequences that manifested themselves later. Researchers who visited the site of the explosion years later reported inexplicable phenomena. Instruments malfunctioned for no reason. Compasses showed the wrong direction. There were cases when people experienced visual and auditory hallucinations. The area radiated a strange feeling of wrongness, as if something fundamental had been disrupted at the level of reality itself. There is a theory that the Tsar Bomba opened a rift in reality that has not completely closed. Theoretical physicists have suggested that a sufficiently powerful energy surge could affect the structure of space-time. An explosion of this magnitude released energy comparable to 1% of the solar radiation falling on Earth per second. This is a colossal amount, capable of causing effects that we do not yet understand. Were there space-time anomalies on Novaya Zemlya after the explosion? There are no documents confirming this, but there are rumors. They say that a secret expedition sent to the site of the explosion in the 1970s discovered an area where the laws of physics did not work as they should. Instruments showed negative time. Objects placed in this area disappeared or changed their properties. The expedition was immediately recalled, and the area was declared particularly dangerous and closed to visitors. Is this true or just a legend? We don't know, but the fact remains. The site of the Tsar Bomba explosion is still closed, more than 60 years after the event. The Tsar Bomba became a symbol of the madness of the arms race. After its test, even the Soviet leadership realized that it had gone too far. Further development of super-powerful bombs was curtailed. Humanity stepped back from the brink of disaster. But the lesson was not fully learned. Nuclear weapons continued to be produced, and tests continued, albeit with less power. And Novaya Zemlya remained a place where man tried to become equal to the gods, and nearly destroyed himself in the attempt. And this place still bears traces of that pride. Radioactive craters, mutated organisms, anomalous zones where nature does not behave as it should. It is a reminder that some boundaries should not be crossed, and some experiments should never be conducted, no matter how good the goals may seem. The Totsky test site in the Orenburg region went down in history as the place where one of the most monstrous experiments on its own people was carried out. On September 14, 1953, Operation Snowball was conducted here. Tactical exercises using real nuclear weapons. A 40-kiloton atomic bomb was detonated over the test site, and then troops were sent through the contaminated zone. 45,000 soldiers, 600 tanks, and 320 aircraft and helicopters. It was a simulation of real combat in a nuclear war. The goal was to test how effectively troops could operate after a nuclear strike. But for the soldiers who participated in the exercises, it turned out to be a death sentence. Most of them received lethal doses of radiation and died within the next few years, and the state pretended that nothing had happened. Marshal Georgy Zhukov personally supervised the exercises. He watched the explosion from a bunker located 8 kilometers from the epicenter. Nikita Khrushchev and other top leaders of the country were with him. For them, it was a spectacle, a demonstration of the power of the Soviet army. But for the soldiers who were sent to attack through the contaminated territory, it was a deadly trap. They were not given protective suits. At most, they were given respirators and raincoats, which offered no protection from radiation. Many did not even receive that. The soldiers went into battle in their regular uniforms, unaware that every breath they took and every touch of the ground brought them closer to a painful death. This was not a military experiment. It was murder committed by the state against its own citizens. After the exercises, all participants were forced to sign non-disclosure agreements. They were forbidden to tell anyone what they had seen and experienced. When soldiers began to fall ill and die en masse, the authorities denied any connection with the exercises. Medical records listed other causes of death: tuberculosis, pneumonia, heart failure. Families were not told the truth. No compensation was paid. It was only in the 1990s, after the collapse of the USSR, that the truth began to emerge. Veterans who had survived until that time began to speak out. Doctors who had remained silent for decades began to testify. It turned out that of the 45,000 participants in the exercises, fewer than 1,000 were still alive by the end of the 1990s. Almost all of them died from diseases related to radiation exposure. And this was no accident. It was a planned study of the effects of radiation on humans in combat conditions. But the exercises at the Totsky training ground are only the tip of the iceberg. There is evidence that similar experiments were conducted repeatedly. At various test sites in the USSR, soldiers were deliberately exposed to radiation, chemical, and biological weapons. They were used as guinea pigs, with no regard for their lives. Documents about these experiments are still classified. We do not know how many people died. We do not know what other tests were conducted. But logic suggests that if the state did this in one case, then there were others. How many unmarked graves are there on the territory of the former testing grounds? How many families never found out what really killed their loved ones? This is a mass crime that has never been punished, because the perpetrator is the state itself. And who judges the state? The territory of the Totsky test site is still contaminated. The radiation level in some areas exceeds the norm by tens of times. Local residents suffer from increased cancer rates, genetic mutations, and immune disorders. But the test site has not been closed. It continues to be used for military exercises, albeit without the use of nuclear weapons. And this raises questions. What is happening there now? What experiments are being conducted away from prying eyes? History has shown that military test sites are places where human life has no value, where ethics and morality give way to military necessity. And as long as these places remain closed, as long as there is no access for independent observers, we cannot be sure that the crimes of the past are not being repeated today. The victims of the Totsky exercises never received justice. There was no official apology. There was no compensation. There was no admission of guilt. The state simply turned a blind eye to the tragedy. And the few who have survived to this day remain forgotten heroes who sacrificed their lives not in a fair fight, but as victims of an inhuman experiment. Their story is a reminder of what power is capable of when it is not limited by law and morality. And it is a warning to future generations: never blindly trust those who wield power, because history is full of examples of how that power has been used against its own people. The Semipalatinsk test site in Kazakhstan was the largest nuclear test site in the USSR. From August 29, 1949 to October 19, 1989, 456 nuclear explosions were carried out here. 116 ground, air, and surface explosions, as well as 340 underground explosions. Some of the charges exceeded 20 megatons in power. In terms of its impact on the environment and the population, this test site became a veritable apocalypse zone. The city of Semipalatinsk, now Semey, with a population of over 300,000, was located only 150 kilometers from the test site. All this time, people were exposed to radiation. They drank contaminated water, ate contaminated food, and breathed contaminated air. And no one warned them of the danger. It was a deliberate mass irradiation of the civilian population. On August 29, 1949, the USSR's first nuclear explosion was carried out at the test site. A test of the RDS-1 device with a yield of 22 kilotons. It was a triumph for Soviet science, proof that the USSR could build its own atomic bomb. But for the residents of the surrounding villages, it was the beginning of a nightmare. The shockwave destroyed houses within a radius of 50 kilometers. The flash of light was visible from 200 kilometers away. The radioactive cloud spread over a huge area. People did not understand what had happened. They were told that it was military exercises, an explosion at an ammunition depot, or lightning strikes of unprecedented power. The truth was hidden. Meanwhile, the radiation was doing its work. People began to lose their hair, develop skin ulcers, and suffer from radiation sickness. But doctors did not link this to the tests. They made other diagnoses, or simply said they did not know the cause. The fate of the village of Sarajal, located 40 kilometers from the epicenter of the first explosion, was particularly dire. After the test, the entire population of the village, about 1,500 people, received severe radiation exposure. Within a year, most of the residents had died. Those who survived were infertile or gave birth to children with severe genetic mutations, but officially, no tragedy had occurred. The village was simply wiped off the map. The people were resettled in other localities and forbidden to talk about what had happened. The graves of the residents of Sarajal are not marked with monuments. Their names are not recorded in any memorials. They remain nameless victims of the atomic project. Isn't this genocide? The deliberate destruction of a population for the sake of military experiments? But the most cynical thing is that the irradiation of the population was not a side effect, but part of the experiment. Declassified documents show that special medical teams regularly examined residents of areas adjacent to the test site. They took tests, recorded symptoms, and studied the development of radiation sickness. People were guinea pigs on which the effects of radiation were studied. And the most terrible thing is that they were not treated. Doctors watched as the disease progressed, and people died, but made no attempt to help, because intervention would have distorted the results of the experiment. It was a scientific study in which human life was merely a statistical unit. When these documents were declassified in the 1990s, the world was horrified, but no one was held accountable. Those responsible had long since died or risen to high positions, and the victims never received justice. The consequences of the Semipalatinsk test site's activities are still being felt today. In the regions adjacent to the test site, abnormally high rates of cancer have been recorded. The percentage of children born with genetic abnormalities is several times higher than the global average. The average life expectancy is lower than in other regions of Kazakhstan. The soil, water, and air still contain radionuclides with long half-lives. It will take centuries to clean up the area. But the main problem is the genetic consequences. Mutations caused by radiation are passed down from generation to generation. The great-grandchildren of people who survived the tests of the 1950s are born with abnormalities. This is a curse that will haunt the region for many generations to come. The Semipalatinsk test site was closed on August 29, 1991, by decree of Kazakh President Nursultan Nazarbayev. This happened exactly 42 years after the first explosion. The closure became a symbol of the end of the nuclear era for Kazakhstan, which voluntarily renounced nuclear weapons and became a nuclear-free zone. But the test site did not disappear. It remained a huge territory the size of a small country, contaminated with radiation, littered with craters from explosions, containing unexploded ordnance and radioactive waste burials. It is a monument to the madness of the Cold War. It is a reminder of the price humanity paid for the arms race. And it is a warning that nuclear weapons are not just military technology, but a threat to the very existence of life on Earth. On March 18, 1980, a disaster occurred at the Plesetsk Cosmodrome that was erased from history for many years. The Vostok 2M carrier rocket with an upper stage was being prepared for the launch of a communications satellite. During refueling, there was a leak of fuel components, nitrogen tetroxide, and unsymmetrical dimethylhydrazine. These were extremely toxic and explosive substances. The crew tried to fix the problem. Then there was an explosion. The rocket blew up right on the launch pad, turning into a giant fireball. 48 people died instantly. Several dozen more suffered severe burns and poisoning from toxic fumes. Many of them died in the days and weeks that followed. It was the biggest disaster in the history of Soviet cosmonautics, but the world only learned about it years later. The tragedy was classified by direct order from Moscow. The information did not leak to the press. The relatives of the deceased were told that their loved ones had died in the line of duty without revealing the circumstances. The funerals were held in private. The graves were not marked with real names. Some of the monuments bore false information. This was done to make it impossible to establish a connection between all the victims and a single event. The official version stated that the disaster was caused by the combat crew who had violated instructions. It was a convenient version to blame the dead, who could not defend themselves. But the reality was different. The explosion was caused by a design flaw in the missile, which the developers knew about but did not fix due to the pressure of the launch deadline. The commander of the combat crew, Captain Sergei Neostroev, was posthumously accused of negligence. His family was deprived of all the benefits and compensation due to the families of military personnel who died in the line of duty. His wife and 2 children were left without a means of subsistence. She tried to get to the truth, appealed to various authorities, and wrote letters. But she was rejected everywhere. She was forced to remain silent and threatened with the loss of her home and job. Only in 2001, 21 years after the tragedy, was Neostroev rehabilitated and the true causes of the disaster acknowledged. But for his family, this was cold compensation. 20 years of shame and poverty could not be undone. And this was just one family among dozens who suffered from the state's lies. After the disaster at Plesetsk, an investigation was conducted, but its results were classified. The commission established that the rocket's design flaw was known at the design stage, but those who would operate the rocket were not informed about it. Moreover, similar fuel leaks had occurred before, but the information about them was not passed on to the combat crews. The safety system was deliberately ignored in order to meet planned targets. Every launch was a risk, but this risk was considered acceptable. Human lives were the price to pay for demonstrating the power of Soviet cosmonautics. And when tragedy struck, the state chose to hide the truth rather than admit its own guilt. The Plesetsk Cosmodrome continued to operate. The launches did not stop. But a dark superstition spread among the staff. They said that those who died in the disaster had not found peace. At night, voices could be heard near the launch pad, and silhouettes of people in protective suits could be seen. Technicians working at the site spoke of a strange feeling of presence, of someone invisible watching them. Some attributed this to the psychological impact of knowing about the tragedy. But there were also those who were convinced that the souls of the victims remained at the site of their death, unable to leave it. The launch pad where the explosion occurred was restored and used for many more years. But strange things always happened there. Unexplained equipment failures, mistakes that should not have happened. In the end, the site was closed and decommissioned. Officially, this was due to obsolescence. But many were convinced that the real reason was different. The tragedy at Plesetsk is part of a broader picture. Throughout the USSR, disasters occurred at classified facilities that the public knew nothing about. Explosions at chemical plants, accidents at nuclear facilities, plane crashes with secret cargo. Each time, the authorities hid the truth, hushed up the scale of the disaster, and blamed the victims. Because admitting the problem would mean admitting the imperfection of the system. And the system had to be perfect. Thousands of lives were sacrificed for the sake of this illusion. The Plesetsk tragedy is just one of many, but it is particularly symbolic because it took place at a spaceport, a facility that was supposed to symbolize the highest achievements of humanity. Instead, it became a place of death for people betrayed by the state they served. In the 1970s and 1980s, the Cold War reached new heights. The United States announced the Strategic Defense Initiative program, known as Star Wars. It was a program to create a space-based missile defense system capable of intercepting and destroying enemy ballistic missiles. The USSR could not stand aside. Soviet scientists began developing their own space weapons. One of the key facilities in this program was the Saryshagin test site on the shore of Lake Balkhash in Kazakhstan. It was a secret test site for anti-missile and anti-space defense. Laser weapons, electronic warfare systems, and satellite destruction systems were tested here. Weapons were created here that were intended to turn space into a theater of war. And this was the beginning of a new era, an era when war could be waged not only on Earth, but also in outer space. The Tsar test site was founded in 1956, but it became most active in the 1970s, when the development of anti-satellite defense systems began. Powerful radars capable of tracking objects in orbit were installed here. Laser installations were built that could hit targets in space. Interceptor missiles capable of shooting down enemy satellites were tested. All this was done in absolute secrecy. American reconnaissance satellites recorded strange activity in the area of Lake Balkhash, but could not determine exactly what was happening there. The Soviet Union was creating a system that, in the event of war, could blind the enemy, depriving it of satellite reconnaissance and communications. This would have been absolute superiority, but it also meant the militarization of space, turning Earth's orbit into a battlefield. One of the most secret facilities at Tsar was the Terra 3 laser installation. It was a ground-based laser complex capable of hitting space targets. The laser's power allowed it to disable satellite optical systems, melt solar batteries, and damage sensitive electronics. Tests were conducted regularly, and according to some reports, Soviet lasers repeatedly blinded American spy satellites. This was always officially denied, but the facts indicate otherwise. In the 1980s, the U.S. recorded several cases when its satellites suddenly lost functionality while flying over the territory of the USSR. Was it a technical malfunction, or was it the result of Soviet space weapons? The question remains open, but the very fact that such weapons existed shows how dangerous the situation was. Humanity was one step away from turning space into a theater of war. But there were also projects at Tsar that are not usually discussed. Declassified fragments of documents mention experiments with new physical principles. What does this mean? It is not known for certain, but experts believe that it could have been about developments in the field of geophysical weapons capable of influencing natural processes, installations that could generate powerful electromagnetic pulses capable of causing earthquakes or influencing the weather. It sounds like science fiction, but the documents indicate that such research was conducted. Moreover, in the 1980s, strange anomalies were recorded in the Tsar area. Unexplained earthquakes, magnetic storms of unprecedented power, and strange phenomena in the ionosphere. All this happened during periods of active activity at the test site. Coincidence? Or the consequences of testing a new type of weapon? Skeptics explain this with military equipment tests, but there are those who believe in more unusual versions. They say that experiments with high-energy weapons could have created rifts in space, portals to other dimensions. It sounds like science fiction, but Soviet science was indeed engaged in the study of exotic phenomena. Declassified documents mention work on the study of torsion fields, psychotronic weapons, and remote mind control. Perhaps Tsar was not only a test site for rockets, but also a laboratory for experiments on the edge of possibility. Abandoned spaceports and test sites are shrouded in mystery and fear. People who worked at these facilities talk about strange experiences that cannot be explained rationally. Visions, hallucinations, lapses in time, encounters with something inexplicable. Skeptics attribute it all to the effects of radiation, stress, and isolation. But there is too much evidence from different sources to consider this a mass delusion. In Plesetsk, they talk about the ghosts of dead cosmonauts and military personnel who roam the abandoned launch pads. In Baikonur, they talk about strange sounds coming from underground tunnels, similar to human voices, even though there is no one there. In Semipalatinsk, there are stories of figures in old gas masks that appear near the craters of nuclear explosions and disappear when approached. Is this folklore, collective hallucinations, or something more? There is a theory that nuclear explosions and missile launches create rifts in the thin fabric of reality. These places become anomalous zones where the laws of physics do not work as they should. Time flows differently, space is distorted, and portals to other dimensions or time layers appear. Esotericists call such places places of power with negative energy, where so much death and suffering has accumulated that it has left an imprint on the very fabric of reality. Physicists cautiously refer to geophysical anomalies and unusual electromagnetic fields. But the essence is the same. These places are different. They differ from ordinary territories, and people who find themselves there can feel it. There is a legend about a ghost rocket at Kapustin Yar. They say that sometimes at night you can see a rocket launching from the old abandoned site. It rises into the sky, leaving a glowing trail behind it, and disappears into the clouds. But the next morning, there are no traces of the launch, no burnt grass, no traces of fuel, nothing. The guards at the test site have observed this phenomenon more than once. Some believe that it is an optical illusion caused by atmospheric phenomena. Others believe that it is the ghost of one of the rockets that exploded at launch many years ago. And there is a version that this is a temporary anomaly. We see a launch that took place in the past or will take place in the future, as if time flows non-linearly in this place. There are especially many mystical stories associated with underground structures at the test sites: bunkers, tunnels, storage facilities. These places are scary even during the day. Concrete corridors leading into the darkness, the echo of footsteps, dripping water, rusty doors with signs saying "No entry" and radiation hazard symbols. But the scariest thing is the feeling of presence. Many researchers who have descended into the underground passages of abandoned facilities report the same thing. The feeling that you are not alone, that someone is watching you from the darkness. Footsteps behind you that fade away when you turn around. Shadows gliding across the walls, even though there is no light source. Voices calling your name. This can be explained as a figment of the imagination in a stressful situation. But when dozens of people experience the same thing at different times, is it a coincidence? There is a practice called stalking, illegally entering abandoned military and industrial facilities. Among stalkers, there are those who specialize in spaceports and test sites. They risk their freedom and even their lives to get into restricted areas, take photos, and shoot videos. And many of them talk about paranormal experiences. One well-known stalker who visited abandoned facilities at Baikonur described how a wave of unbearable fear came over him in one of the hangars. The fear was groundless. There was no danger, but his body refused to obey his mind, demanding that he leave the place immediately. He ran out of the hangar and never returned. It later turned out that a disaster had once occurred in this hangar, claiming the lives of several workers. There is a theory that places of mass death retain the energetic imprint of the tragedy. This phenomenon is called the power spot effect, or geopathogenic zone. According to this theory, strong emotions, fear, pain, despair, leave a mark on space, and this mark can affect living people, causing them to experience the emotions that the dead experienced. From a scientific point of view, this has not been proven, but esotericists and psychics claim that such zones are real. And abandoned test sites, where thousands of people died, are precisely such places. The curse of the test sites is not a metaphor, but a reality that can only be felt by visiting them. Today, abandoned spaceports and testing grounds attract a special type of researcher: urbanists, historians, journalists, and simply curious people. These people are willing to take risks to enter restricted areas and see what the authorities prefer to hide. Entering closed facilities is illegal and punishable by fines or even imprisonment. But that doesn't stop enthusiasts. They squeeze through holes in fences, bypass patrols, and disguise themselves as locals. Their goal is not only to take photos and videos, but also to collect artifacts, documents, equipment samples, and personal belongings of people who worked at these sites. All this allows them to reconstruct a history that official sources keep quiet about. Thanks to such researchers, we know many facts that would otherwise remain buried under the seal of secrecy. One of the most famous cases was the visit of 2 Ukrainian stalkers to Baikonur in 2024. They illegally entered the territory of the Cosmodrome, reached an abandoned hangar with the Buran spacecraft, and took stunning footage. Their video went viral around the world, sparking a wave of interest in the fate of Soviet spacecraft. The Kazakh authorities launched an investigation, but the stalkers had already left the country. Their footage showed the world the true state of the Buran spacecraft. Not romanticized museum exhibits, but slowly decaying piles of metal that no one was taking care of. This was inconvenient for the authorities, who had promised for years to preserve the spacecraft, but had done nothing. Thanks to the stalkers, the truth came out, and public pressure began to mount on the government to take action. In addition to stalkers, there are also official research expeditions. Scientists study the long-term consequences of nuclear tests, ecologists assess the degree of contamination of the territories, and historians try to reconstruct events for which documentation has been lost or classified. These expeditions face many problems. First, the high level of radiation at many sites limits the time spent there. Second, the destruction of infrastructure makes some places difficult to access or dangerous. Third, bureaucratic obstacles. Obtaining permission to visit closed areas can take months or years. But despite the difficulties, the work continues. Each expedition brings new discoveries, new facts, new evidence of a history that people tried to forget. Of particular interest are the archives left behind in abandoned facilities. During the hasty evacuation in the 1990s, many documents were left behind. Stalkers find folders with drawings, test reports, personal files of employees, and photographs in abandoned buildings. This is invaluable material for historians. But there is a problem. These documents are slowly being destroyed by time and nature. Paper rots from moisture, fades in the sun, and is eaten by rodents. Every year, there is less and less information. Some enthusiasts are engaged in saving these archives. They take the documents, scan them, and post them on the internet, making them available to researchers. This is illegal from a legal point of view, the removal of documents from state facilities. But from a moral point of view, It is the preservation of history that the state itself has abandoned to fate. Modern technologies open up new opportunities for exploring abandoned sites. Drones allow you to photograph areas from the air without putting people in danger. Ground-penetrating radar can detect underground structures that no one knew existed. New generation dosimeters provide an accurate picture of radiation contamination. Three-dimensional scanning allows us to create digital models of objects that may soon be completely destroyed. All this makes it possible to preserve for future generations at least a virtual copy of what was created during the Soviet era. Because physically, these objects are doomed. Time, weather, vandals, all of this destroys what was once built to last for centuries. An interesting question: should these objects be preserved? On the one hand, they are historical monuments, evidence of an era when humanity was on the brink of self-destruction. On the other hand, they are symbols of the madness of the Cold War, places of death and suffering for thousands of people. Some believe that they should be turned into museums so that people remember the lessons of the past. Others believe that it is better to destroy everything and forget it, like a bad dream. But so far, no decision has been made. The facilities continue to exist in limbo, not museums, but not quite ruins. They are slowly dying, forgotten by everyone except a few enthusiasts. And with them, history dies, which we may never fully know. So what do the ruins of Soviet spaceports and test sites ultimately hide? The obvious things: technical documentation, traces of experiments, evidence of tragedies. But perhaps there are deeper secrets. There is a theory that some Cold War experiments went so far beyond the limits of what was permissible that their results were not simply classified, but attempts were made to destroy them completely. We are talking about research in the field of psychotronic weapons, weather control, influencing tectonic processes, and manipulating space and time. It sounds like the ravings of a conspiracy theorist, but there are indeed references to such programs in the declassified archives of the KGB and GRU. The Mercury program studied the possibility of influencing the human psyche from a distance. The Typhoon program attempted to control weather phenomena for military purposes. The Almaz program involved the creation of orbital combat stations with directed energy weapons. Most of these programs were shut down in the 1980s or 1990s. Officially, this was due to a lack of funding and a lack of prospects. But there is a theory that the reason was something else. The results of the experiments proved too dangerous, even for those who conducted them. There are rumors of an incident at one of the test sites in Siberia in the late 1980s, when an experiment with a certain device got out of control. Allegedly, there was a release of unknown energy that disabled all electronics within a radius of hundreds of kilometers and caused mass hallucinations among the personnel. The facility was evacuated, all participants in the experiment were isolated, and the device itself was destroyed. The documentation has been classified forever. Is this true or just a legend? It is impossible to verify. Those who know the truth remain silent. Another mystery is connected with underground complexes. Beneath many test sites and spaceports, there is an extensive network of tunnels and bunkers. Their official purpose is to protect personnel and equipment, storage facilities, and command posts. But the scale of some underground structures suggests that they could have been used for something else. There is a theory about the existence of secret underground cities, autonomous complexes capable of supporting the lives of hundreds of people for months or even years. These cities were intended for the country's leadership and key specialists in the event of nuclear war. But were they only built where we know about them? Under Moscow? Under the Urals? Or are there others that we know nothing about, hidden under abandoned test sites in Siberia and Kazakhstan? An interesting fact: satellite images of some abandoned facilities show strange details. Ventilation shafts that clearly lead deep underground. Access roads to mysterious structures that do not appear in any official documents. Traces of recent activity in places that were supposedly closed decades ago. It could be anything from the secret burial of radioactive waste to the continuation of classified research. But as long as access to these sites is restricted, it is impossible to find out the truth. And those who try to enter illegally risk not only their freedom, but also their lives. Some areas are guarded with lethal force. There is another aspect that is rarely discussed: the environmental disaster that abandoned test sites represent. Radioactive contamination is just the tip of the iceberg. Toxic chemicals used in rocket fuel, heptyl, nitric acid, kerosene, have seeped into the soil and groundwater, poisoning the ecosystem for decades to come. Military equipment and machinery are buried in the ground, rusting and releasing heavy metals. All this creates dead zones where plants do not grow, animals do not live, and the earth itself is poisoned. And no one is cleaning up these areas. There is no money, no technology, no desire. It is easier to pretend that the problem does not exist. But the biggest secret is what we do not know. How many more classified sites exist that are not even rumored to exist? How many experiments have been conducted, the documents of which have been destroyed? How many people have died or been injured, whose names will never be known? The history of the Cold War has only been partially written. Many pages have been torn out, and many chapters will never be declassified. And the ruins of Soviet test sites and spaceports are silent witnesses to a history that we may never fully know. They hold secrets buried under concrete and metal, under a layer of radioactive dust and oblivion. And maybe that's for the best. Some secrets are better left buried.